My wife handed me divorce papers at my own retirement party, while my children clapped as if it were a performance they had rehearsed. That was the moment I understood what betrayal truly felt like. My name is Andrew Hartley. For 36 years, I repaired utility lines in brutal storms, scorching summers, and long nights that most people slept comfortably through. I did it for them, for my family, for the people I believed loved me. Yet on the night meant to honor my decades of service, my wife and children decided to celebrate my downfall. They thought they were taking half of nothing. They thought I had spent my life breaking my back for a paycheck that barely kept food on the table. They thought I had nothing left to give and no strength to fight back. But they were wrong, and they had no idea how wrong. The hall was filled with coworkers, neighbors, supervisors, men and women who had watched me climb freezing poles at dawn and crawl under damaged structures to restore power. They came to show gratitude, to shake my hand, to smile. My family came to end me. My wife, Eliza, had planned every detail of the event. She chose the venue, arranged the food, and positioned herself at the center of every conversation. She played the role of the supportive spouse so convincingly that no one suspected what she had prepared. My children, Rowan and Paige, stood behind her like shadows cast from the same flame. When she walked onto the small stage with a microphone in hand, people quieted, expecting the usual sentimental speech. Instead, she pulled a beige envelope from her purse and handed it to me with a practiced smile. Andrew, after all these years, we both deserve new beginnings. I opened the envelope and saw the words, "Petition for dissolution of marriage." The papers were dated from the day before. She had already filed. Gasps filled the room. Forks clinked onto plates. Someone whispered, "Is this real?" Rowan nodded proudly. Paige even laughed. They applauded. Actually applauded. That was when I realized they had been preparing for this. They had planned their escape long before tonight. And for months, maybe longer, I had been living with strangers. But while they had been planning to replace me, I had been preparing for something entirely different. For over 15 years, every overtime shift, every emergency call, and every extra holiday payment had gone into a plan I had never spoken aloud. While Eliza criticized my lack of ambition, and my children apologized to their friends for having a father who worked with his hands, I had been studying something else: real estate, markets, property management, the kind of work that does not wear boots or gloves but still builds wealth. My first property was a rundown duplex I purchased with saved overtime money. I renovated it myself, replacing floors on my days off and repairing the roof on nights when Eliza thought I was working extra. In less than a year, it became a steady source of income. Then I bought another property. Then another. The empire did not grow fast. It grew quietly, patiently, like a tree growing underground before breaking through the surface. By the time Eliza handed me those papers, I owned 11 properties, all purchased legally under my name alone. All funded by my individual earnings, all documented, all protected. No one knew. Not Eliza, not Rowan, not Paige, not even my closest co-workers. They judged me based on stained work boots and weathered hands. They assumed I lived small because I thought small. They mistook humility for weakness and silence for stupidity. But standing there in the center of that crowded hall with divorce papers in my hand, I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not shock. Something calmer, sharper. A clarity forged from 36 years of watching storms roll in before anyone else noticed the clouds. I looked at Eliza, then at my children, then at the co-workers, who knew the real weight of my labor. And I smiled. a quiet smile that made Eliza's confidence flicker. She thought she had won. She thought she had stripped me of everything. But the truth was about to turn the entire room upside down. Because when quiet men decide they are finished being quiet, the world learns exactly what it overlooked. And that night, they were all about to learn. I used to believe disrespect came in loud moments, in slammed doors or shouted insults. I learned instead that the deepest kind of humiliation arrives quietly, disguised as jokes, comments made in passing, or the subtle tightening of a smile when someone introduces you. My wife Eliza was always polite when she spoke about me in public, but there was a tone she used, a softness too careful, too rehearsed, that made me feel like an object on a shelf. If someone asked her what I did for a living, she would pause as if choosing the least embarrassing description. Then she would say, "He works outside. He fixes things for the region." Not a single word about the risks, the certifications, or the years of training involved. Nothing about the nights I climbed structures coated in ice, or the storms that nearly swept me off platforms. She never said he helps keep thousands of people safe, even though it was the truth. The worst part was how naturally she said it, as if my work were something to hide, an inconvenience she carried like a wrinkled receipt at the bottom of her purse, and people believed her. They nodded politely, eyes gliding past me, already searching for someone more impressive to speak to. Our children absorbed that tone long before they understood its weight. Rowan, the older of the two, learned early how to reshape my job into something vague whenever he spoke about me. If one of his friends asked what I did, he would shrug and say, "Something outdoors." He does maintenance. Maintenance. The word felt like a bucket of cold water thrown across my work boots. Paige, my daughter, did not even bother to use words. She simply changed the subject. If someone asked what her parents did, she talked about her mother, how Eliza worked in management at an administrative office not far from home. But when it came to me, Paige would smile politely and say, "My dad is busy most of the time." That was it. Like my entire identity ended at the driveway. They grew embarrassed of me slowly, like a stain spreading across fabric. I saw it in the way they dressed when we went out, as though they wanted strangers to know immediately that they belonged somewhere better, somewhere that did not include the man walking behind them in worn work pants and boots. But the embarrassment was only the first cut. The second came when they reduced me to a wallet with a pulse. Rowan would ask for money with a tone that suggested he was doing me a favor by including me in his future. "Dad, I know you don't have much, but can you help me with fees?" He always said it as if expecting me to say no, as if generosity were something I had no right to practice. Paige asked too, but she did it gently, with that careful sweetness that made me feel even smaller. "Dad, I would never ask unless I absolutely had to," she would say. "You are my last option." Being your child's last option is a special kind of ache. At home, Eliza perfected the art of smiling at my simplicity. That is what she called it when speaking to her sister on the phone. "James is simple," she would say. "Give him a quiet evening and some basic tools, and he is content." Her sister laughed once and joked, "Well, at least he is low maintenance." They thought I could not hear them. They were wrong. What I realized over the years was that Eliza did not just see me as ordinary. She saw me as ordinary in a way that was inconvenient to her. She wanted to move in circles where people flaunted their careers, flashed their vacations, and compared six-figure salaries like trophies on a wall. And whenever she walked into those rooms with me, she felt smaller, not because of anything I did, but because she measured her worth through the opinions of people who barely knew her. The thing that surprised me most was not her shame. It was how routine it became. The jokes, the sighs, the tiny corrections she would whisper into the air, just loud enough for me to catch. He does not need much. He is used to simple things. He never asks for anything special. Every word was a splinter pressed deeper under my skin, and I told myself to ignore it, to understand that people speak carelessly when they are stressed or unhappy. But year after year, the splinters became wounds, and the wounds became calluses. And when my children grew old enough to mimic her, when they began treating me as if I were a piece of furniture, holding up the family but never admired, that is when something inside me began to shift. I learned to grow quiet. I learned to observe. And most importantly, I learned to plan. Because being underestimated is painful, but it is also powerful, especially when the people underestimating you are the ones you sacrifice the most for. People think reinvention happens in bright, dramatic ways. They imagine a person waking up one morning suddenly determined to change their life. Mine began quietly, on a night when the wind rattled the windows and the house felt too small for the disappointment echoing inside it. Eliza had spent the entire evening talking about a friend's husband who had just been promoted. She spoke his name with admiration thick enough to taste, and every sentence held the unspoken weight of comparison. I had gone outside afterward, not because I needed air, but because I needed space from the feeling of being measured and found lacking. I ended up in the old shed behind our house, the one with creaking hinges and a roof patched in 3 different places. I sat at the workbench, staring at my hands roughened by decades of labor. And I wondered if they could build more than what the world had assigned to them. That was where the idea began, not as a dream, as a question. What would happen if I invested the time and effort I gave to everyone else into something of my own? The first step came unexpectedly. A colleague mentioned he had inherited a dilapidated property he wanted to sell quickly. I had some money saved from dangerous winter overtime, money no one in the family ever asked about because they assumed I had none. I bought the property without telling anyone. It was not worth much. The floors sagged, the windows rattled, the plumbing hissed like a warning. But it was mine, and I knew how to fix things. Every evening after work, I drove there with a thermos of coffee and my old tool bag. I replaced pipes, sanded walls, repaired broken steps, and patched roofs until my back ached and my hands stung. Sometimes I stayed so late that the sunrise found me on the porch, covered in sawdust. 3 months later, the place had transformed. I rented it to a young couple who said it felt like a fresh start. Their rent covered the mortgage and left a small profit. Small, yes, but it was my first taste of building something outside the life I had been confined to. The second step came more easily. A property foreclosed after a storm had damaged half its roof. I fixed it piece by piece, learning more each time. Then came a third, a fourth. Some rural, some in areas most people drove past without noticing. I looked for what others ignored, what they dismissed, what they assumed held no value. I became obsessed with learning. I studied repair manuals, finance books, old real estate guides, anything I could get my hands on. I kept a notebook filled with rental projections, cost breakdowns, and schedules. I learned how to negotiate quietly, how to recognize a seller who needed a quick deal, and how to predict which tenants would stay for years. And through it all, I said nothing. Silence, I discovered, is a powerful shield. If I had told Eliza, she would have found a way to claim the income for family expenses, or justify from thin air why those earnings belonged to her. If I had told Rowan or Paige, they would have heard only the part where they imagined themselves benefiting. So I kept the empire hidden in plain sight. I used a separate account, documented every receipt, and kept digital backups in a password-protected folder. I even kept keys under a loose floorboard in the shed, the one place no one in the family ever bothered to step foot in. but secrecy came with its own kind of risk. One evening, as I was sorting papers in the shed, I heard footsteps behind the door. I froze. The shadows outside shifted, and the handle rattled lightly, as if someone were testing whether it was locked. I did not breathe. After a moment, the footsteps retreated. I opened the door quietly and saw Eliza walking away, holding her phone. When she saw me, she flinched and forced a smile, pretending she had just been out for fresh air. But I knew better. Something had changed. She had grown suspicious. And suspicion, in a marriage already cracked, becomes a kind of weapon. After that night, I installed a small safe beneath the workbench and moved my documents there. 15 years passed like this, property by property, plan by plan. Sacrifice by sacrifice. From the outside, nothing about my life appeared different. I still wore the same weather-beaten jacket. I still packed lunches in simple containers. I still drove the same old truck. And to my family, that was proof enough that I had achieved nothing remarkable. But in the shadows of their assumptions, my 14-hour days were building something they could not imagine. By the time my retirement approached, I owned 12 properties, each rented, each producing steady income. Some were modest, some were surprisingly valuable. All of them were the result of years of sweat and silence. And as I looked at the life I had built, hidden behind walls of indifference and disrespect, I realized something important. You do not need applause to build a future. You just need purpose and privacy. What I didn't realize yet was how soon that privacy would shatter and how violently everything I had built would come into the light. There is a moment in every collapsing relationship when the truth stops whispering and begins to speak plainly. For me, that moment arrived on an afternoon that should have been ordinary. I came home earlier than usual, exhausted from a long shift, and found Eliza sitting at the kitchen table, her back straight, her shoulders tight, her phone held just out of my line of sight. She looked startled when I walked in, as if she had been caught practicing a script. "You are home early," she said, pressing her phone face down. Her voice was too bright, too controlled. It was the first clue that something in our marriage had already begun to rot. From that day on, small inconsistencies began tugging at my attention. Eliza suddenly cared more about her appearance than she had in years. She bought new clothes far more expensive than what she normally allowed herself. She changed her perfume. She started leaving the house dressed in colors she had not worn since she was in her 20s. When I asked where she was going, she always had the same response: errands, meetings, catching up with friends. But the stories never added up. Sometimes she returned 3 hours later than she claimed she would. Sometimes she came home flushed, either from excitement or guilt, I could not tell. More than once, she walked inside with her blouse slightly misbuttoned or her lipstick smudged. Then there was her phone. The device she once left casually on the counter now traveled with her everywhere, like a newborn infant. She changed her passcode. She turned off notifications. When she received messages, the phone remained silent, vibrating faintly inside her purse like a secret heart. I wanted to confront her, but instinct told me that confrontation too early would give her time to sharpen her lies. Information, I had learned, could be worth more than courage. And so I waited, watching as the cracks widened. It was not only Eliza who changed. Rowan started calling Eliza more often than he called me. Their conversations dropped to hushed tones the moment I entered a room. Paige, who used to stop by the house unannounced, now arrived only when Eliza was home. They exchanged glances during dinners, glances I had never seen before. Shared understanding. Shared secrecy. One evening, I overheard a conversation that confirmed what I had already begun to piece together. It happened late at night when I went downstairs for a glass of water. Voices drifted from the living room, Eliza and Rowan. Their tones were sharp, urgent, almost electric with planning. "He will not fight you," Rowan said. "Dad never fights anything. Just serve the papers and be done with it." I froze. My heart stumbled in my chest. Eliza sighed. "You do not understand. I need to make sure everything is prepared before that happens. I cannot afford surprises." Then Paige's voice, thin and nervous. "What if he asks questions? What if he wants time to think?" Eliza answered with a cold certainty I had not heard from her before. "He will not. He feels guilty about everything. He always has. He will sign whatever is put in front of him." Rowan added, "And after that, we can finally fix things around here. People will take us seriously again," Paige whispered. "And we can keep the house. The house. My house. The place I repaired with my own hands, roof to foundation." Hearing my children calculate what they would take from me was worse than hearing my wife plan how to cut me out of her future. It was betrayal, layered upon betrayal, delivered in their natural voices, as casually as if they were planning a family trip. I stepped back into the darkness of the hallway, my breath trapped in my throat. My hands trembled around the glass. For the first time in years, I felt something dangerous rising inside me. Not anger, not grief, something colder. A clarity that scraped away all illusions. It was no longer just a failing marriage. It was a coordinated extraction. Exactly like I feared. I knew then that Eliza believed I had nothing worth protecting. She assumed my life savings were whatever sat in the shared bank account. She assumed the house was my greatest asset. She assumed my silence meant ignorance. They all assumed I had nothing to lose because they had never bothered to ask what I had built. The next morning, Eliza prepared breakfast with unusual enthusiasm, humming to herself as if the night before had never happened. She placed a plate in front of me, smiled too sweetly, and said she had been thinking about our future. Our future. It tasted like poison on her tongue. As she spoke about downsizing, about adjusting investments, about splitting things fairly, I watched the way her eyes avoided mine. She was testing the waters, seeing if I would resist, seeing if I suspected anything. I pretended to be distracted. I nodded in all the right places. I kept my voice level. And inside, a plan began to grow roots. They believed they were orchestrating a clean, silent exit. They believed I would quietly accept whatever they handed me. But they had forgotten one thing. I had spent 15 years preparing for a moment exactly like this. A moment when silence was not surrender. A moment when the truth, once spoken, would be impossible for anyone to swallow. And as I watched Eliza stir her coffee, unable to look directly at me, I understood clearly. The night of my retirement party would not be the end of my humiliation. It would be the end of theirs. The hall was full long before I arrived. Rows of folding chairs stretched across the polished floor, and long tables shimmered with food brought in by co-workers, neighbors, and people who had known me for half my life. It was strange, seeing the room so full, knowing that every person there had come to honor me, except the 3 who shared my home. Eliza had organized everything, insisting it was her way of thanking me for years of work. She decorated the room with photographs of me in old uniforms, smiling awkwardly while standing on platforms in bad weather. It looked sincere on the surface, but the air around her was sharp, almost expectant, like she was waiting for the curtain to rise on a performance only she understood. When I walked in, people clapped. Real applause, the kind that warms your chest. I saw old supervisors, co-workers from years past, even a few people I had helped during emergency calls. Their faces held genuine respect, the kind I had rarely seen at home. For the first time that evening, I felt something like peace. It lasted 3 minutes. Rowan and Paige stood toward the back of the crowd, whispering to each other. Rowan smirked when he saw me. Paige looked pressed, as if wearing a mask too tight for her face. They glanced at their mother as she moved around the room, greeting people like the star of the event. The speeches began. Co-workers stood up one by one, sharing stories of storms survived, nights I refused to leave until everything was fixed, moments when I put myself at risk to ensure others stayed safe. People laughed, wiped their eyes, raised their glasses. Then it was Eliza's turn. She walked up to the microphone slowly, placing a hand over her heart, as if overcome by emotion. I saw Rowan straighten, and Paige clasp her hands together, nerves and anticipation tangled into one. "I want to thank everyone for being here tonight," she said. "James has given so much of himself to this job, so much to this town. And now, after all these years, it is time for him to finally rest." People nodded. Some clapped quietly. But Eliza was not finished. She smiled at me, a soft, practiced smile, then lifted a beige envelope from the table. "And because I believe in being honest about new beginnings, tonight feels like the right moment for this." The room stilled. Chairs creaked as people leaned forward. Eliza approached me and handed me the envelope with both hands, as if offering a gift. "These," she said, "are divorce papers. I filed them yesterday." The microphone picked up someone gasping. Then someone else muttered a curse under their breath. Rowan and Paige clapped, not loudly, but with enough force to make sure everyone heard it. Paige whispered something to her brother that made him snort a quiet laugh. I looked at them calmly. I did not flinch. I did not ask why. And that is when they knew something was wrong. Because the man they expected to crumble did not move at all. "Thank you, Eliza," I said. My voice was steady enough to make her blink. "This is very thoughtful." People looked confused. Eliza's smile tightened. She expected shock, not stillness. Somehow, she sensed the script slipping out of her hands. Rowan stepped forward. "Dad, we talked about this. It is time. This is good for everyone," Paige added. "Finally?" Finally. The word struck me like a pebble on glass. Small, sharp, enough to crack. I stood up and looked around the room. Dozens of people watched me, waiting to see what would happen. "Since we are being honest tonight," I said, "perhaps I should share some truths as well." Eliza's expression flickered. "James," she whispered sharply, "do not make a scene." "A scene," I repeated. "All right, let us begin quietly then." I turned toward the crowd. My wife is leaving me because she thinks I have nothing left to offer. But she has forgotten something important. Secrets have a habit of showing up on the doorstep at the worst possible time. Someone shifted uncomfortably. Rowan frowned. Paige's hands trembled. I continued. "Eliza has been in a relationship with someone she met at a private wellness retreat." That sentence split the room in half. Gasps echoed like breaking branches. A woman dropped her fork. Rowan's jaw fell open. Paige stumbled backward. Eliza's face drained of color. "James," she hissed, "you have misunderstood." "No," I said. "I misunderstood for a long time." But not anymore. I pulled my phone from my pocket and held it up. Inside are messages, dates, photographs, and voice memos. Enough clarity to end any debate. Eliza reached for the phone, but I lowered it. "Not tonight. Tonight we celebrate transparency." Rowan shook his head, trying to recover control. "Dad, even if that is true, you and Mom have grown apart. You do not have much anyway. It is time to split things and move on." The disrespect in that sentence was astonishing. I smiled. "Is that what you believe, Rowan?" "That I have nothing," Rowan hesitated. "Well, yes." "Good," I said. "Let us talk about that." Then came the moment that changed everything. My phone buzzed. A call. On the screen, the manager who oversaw a cluster of my properties. "Excuse me," I told the crowd, and answered. His voice projected through the quiet hall. "Mr. Hartley, we got the offer on the building you were considering selling. Full cash. They want to close fast." The room erupted in whispers. Rowan paled. Paige pressed a hand to her mouth. I nodded into the phone. "Good. Tell them I will review it in the morning. Thank you." When I hung up, the silence felt like a held breath about to collapse. I turned back to my family. "Eliza, you thought I owned nothing. Rowan and Paige, you believed I lived paycheck to paycheck. But for 15 years, I have purchased 12 properties, with my own hands, my own money, and my own risk. All of them legally separate from our marriage, all of them documented, all of them protected. You planned to take half of nothing, so nothing is what you will receive." I signed the divorce papers with calm hands, then handed them back to Eliza. "Your new beginning," I said, "is yours alone." The room was so silent I could hear my own heartbeat, and in that silence, Eliza finally understood. She had not married a simple man. She had underestimated a quiet one, a fatal mistake. The morning after the party felt strangely calm. I expected to wake to chaos, to angry messages, to accusations and threats. Instead, there was only silence, a deep, echoing silence that felt like the pause between lightning and thunder. The thunder arrived at 9:32. My phone rang with an unfamiliar number. When I answered, a tight, irritated voice introduced himself as the attorney Eliza had hired. He spoke quickly, as if trying to regain control of a narrative that had slipped through his fingers. "Mr. Hartley," he began, sharp and rehearsed. "We need to discuss the disclosure of assets presented last night. My client was unaware of your holdings." Holdings. The word sounded sour on his tongue, as though it offended him to acknowledge that I possessed anything of value. I responded plainly. Nothing was hidden. She never asked. He cleared his throat. "Regardless, you must provide full documentation so we can determine division of marital property." I held my voice steady. Every property in question was purchased with separate funds, titled, in my name only, and thoroughly documented. They do not fall under marital distribution. He paused long enough for me to picture the bile rising in his throat. "We will see what a judge says. I already knew. My attorney, Patricia, had reviewed everything years ago when I first suspected Eliza might one day try to take what she believed she deserved. Patricia understood state law with brutal clarity. Separate assets were separate assets. End of discussion. We met later that day. When she saw me walk in carrying a thick folder, she shook her head with an almost amused expression. "James," she said, "most people do not keep records like this unless they already know they will need them." I smiled back. I learned to prepare for storms a long time ago. She flipped through the documents, her eyes scanning receipts, contracts, ledgers, and timestamps. After 20 minutes, she closed the folder and leaned back. "This case is over. She has no legal claim. In legal terms, it was surgical. In emotional terms, it was devastating, at least for Eliza." When the mediation meeting took place, she arrived with red eyes and a brittle posture, as if she had not slept. Rowan and Paige sat behind her, stiff with embarrassment. They were not there to support their mother. They were there because their world had blown apart, and they were desperately hoping the pieces could be glued back together. Eliza's lawyer began aggressively, trying to argue that 15 years of secret investing was an act of marital betrayal. Patricia countered with law, documentation, and calm expertise that sliced through theatrics like a blade through paper. The verdict was inevitable. Eliza walked away with the small joint savings account and the older family vehicle. Total value, less than $30,000. Not enough to fund a new start. Not enough to maintain her social circle. Not enough to impress the man she had been seeing behind my back. I heard through a neighbor days later that her lover had left her. Apparently, the fantasy of starting a new life together shriveled instantly once he learned she was not receiving the windfall she had promised him. As for my children, their fall came even faster. Rowan's postgraduate tuition was due within weeks. He had counted on me to fund it, assuming I would cave the way I always had. When I refused, he tried to take out a private loan, but his credit was too thin, his debt too high. Without payment, he was removed from the program for the semester. The shame hit him harder than any financial burden. Paige's business plan collapsed next. She had pitched her idea to investors using my name as an assumed source of backing. When they learned that I was not involved, they withdrew immediately. Her remaining savings evaporated within a month. The social consequences were brutal. Friends whispered. Neighbors gossiped. People who once admired Eliza's curated perfection now shook their heads, astonished at the truth. The woman who spent years complaining that her husband lacked ambition had left a quiet millionaire for fantasies and lies. That kind of humiliation lingers, and in small communities, it spreads like smoke. Meanwhile, I continued my life with the same routine peace I had kept for years. My properties operated smoothly. My income arrived at the start of each month. My phone buzzed with updates, repair schedules, and tenant renewals. And every time I opened an email confirming another deposit, I felt something I had not felt in decades. Not pride, not revenge, not vindication. Relief. The storm had finally passed, and for the first time, the damage left behind did not belong to me. The months following the divorce unfolded like a slow unraveling, each thread revealing truths my children had spent years avoiding. Rowan was the first to experience the weight of reality. For years, he had floated on expectations, assuming the world would stretch itself to accommodate him the way I had always done. But when his postgraduate program removed him for non-payment, the fall was abrupt and unsoftened. I learned later that he stood in the administrator's office, trying to negotiate an extension, insisting that his family was going through a difficult time and that he would bring the funds soon. But the administrator, unmoved by vague promises, handed him a withdrawal notice. Rowan walked out with the paper clenched in his hand, the ink still drying, the future he had constructed in his mind collapsing like a badly built wall. He did not call me that day. He did not call the next. It took him nearly 2 weeks before he gathered the courage. And when he did, his voice sounded like someone who had discovered gravity for the first time. "Dad," he said quietly, "I got a job." I waited. At a supply warehouse, loading shipments, 40 hours a week. It was honest work, tiring work, work that left calluses and sore shoulders. But for the first time, Rowan understood the dignity in earning something with effort instead of entitlement. He told me once, much later, that on his first day he had to lift a stack of heavy crates, and halfway through realized he had never respected my job because he had never understood physical exhaustion. He had never understood what it meant to push through, to show up, to carry weight that no one else saw. Paige's reckoning came differently. Her business idea, something she had imagined branding and shaping into a reflection of her own importance, had withered when her investors pulled out. Without a co-signer, she could not secure a loan. Without savings, she could not rent a space. The networking events she used to attend eagerly became sources of shame because she no longer had news to boast about. So she began working at a small wellness center, teaching group classes and assisting with administrative tasks. It was not glamorous or high profile, but it forced her to confront something she had always avoided: humility. She learned to speak kindly to clients. She learned to solve problems without blaming others. She learned to organize her own life, budget her own paycheck, and show up even when she did not feel like it. For months, she did not call me. Not because she was angry, because she was ashamed. When she finally did, her voice cracked as she said, "Dad, I never knew how hard you worked. I never understood. But I do now." Those words lingered with me, soft but powerful, like a bandage pressed over an old scar. Eliza, on the other hand, remained unchanged. She reached out once, then again, then again. Her messages stretched between apology and justification, circling the same tired phrases. We made mistakes. We misunderstood. We were under pressure. I was confused. I made poor choices. But even in her apologies, there was a tone that betrayed her true intentions. She wanted the comfort she had lost, not the man she had betrayed. I replied rarely, and when I did, my responses were brief, polite, and final. It wasn't anger keeping me distant. It was clarity. Some doors, once closed, are not meant to be opened again. But my children, they were different. They were changing. Rowan began asking questions he had never asked before. "Dad, how did you manage stress all those years? Dad, how did you keep going when nobody appreciated you? Dad, how did you know what investments to make?" Paige began visiting on quiet afternoons, bringing homemade meals, telling me about clients she helped and progress she was proud of. She no longer spoke as someone performing success. She spoke as someone earning it. It was not forgiveness yet. Forgiveness requires time, but it was something better than apologies. It was effort. Genuine, unforced, humbling effort. And in that effort, I saw the possibility of rebuilding, not the family we once were, but a new one built on truth rather than assumption, respect rather than entitlement. The transformation was slow, but for the first time, it was real. Spring arrived quietly that year, the kind that comes not with celebration but with a steady shift in the air. The frost melted slowly, the ground softened, and mornings began to glow with a warmth I had not felt in a long time. It matched the way my life had begun to change. Subtle, steady, impossible to ignore. I spent many mornings sitting on the porch of the small piece of land I had bought years earlier, a place tucked away from noise and judgment. I built a simple wooden chair there, and from it I could see the fields stretching into a silence that felt like peace. My properties ran like clockwork. Rent was deposited on time. Repairs were scheduled with reliable crews. My phone buzzed occasionally, but never with urgency. For the first time in decades, life felt manageable, almost weightless. But healing is not just the absence of chaos. Healing is the presence of clarity. Rowan visited first. He pulled into the driveway in an old car that rattled at every stop. He stepped out wearing a uniform from the supply warehouse, the kind of job he once considered beneath him. There was no arrogance in his posture now, just tired honesty. He sat beside me on the porch, his hands clasped. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then he said quietly, "The thing I never understood is how you carried all of this alone. I used to think you stayed silent because you were weak. But you were strong, stronger than any of us ever gave you credit for." I did not praise him. I did not reassure him. Instead, I said, "Sometimes people do not ask how heavy a load is. They only notice when you put it down." He nodded, his eyes damp with something he fought to hide. In that moment, I realized he was not the boy who had clapped at a divorce party. He was a man learning what responsibility cost. Paige came 2 weeks later. She arrived after finishing her shift, hair tied back, gym bag hanging over one shoulder. She looked older, not in a tired way, but in a grounded way. She hugged me without hesitation, something she had not done in years. "Dad," she said, "I used to think having everything made life easier. Now I see that earning things makes life meaningful. I wish I had learned that sooner." "You learned it when you were ready," I replied. She sat with me for an hour, telling me about the women she trained, women who struggled and pushed and fought to improve their lives. She said they reminded her of me. It was the first time she had ever compared me to something admirable. I felt the words settle inside me like a stone, placed gently in water. As for Eliza, her presence faded with the passing months. She continued working, continued living in the small apartment she had rented, continued searching for the approval that had always mattered more to her than truth. She sent messages occasionally, soft attempts at reconnecting, but I answered less and less. Not because I wanted revenge, but because peace has a price. And sometimes that price is distance. One evening, as I sat reviewing rental income statements, I realized something unexpected. I no longer felt the urge to prove anything. Not to Eliza, not to Rowan, not to Paige, not to anyone. The truth was mine. My journey belonged to me. Their misunderstanding had shaped me, but it no longer defined me. What mattered now was what I chose to carry forward. Rowan eventually returned to school, this time paying for his classes one course at a time. Paige saved enough to start a small studio of her own, built not on borrowed pride but on genuine skill. They still visited often, not because they needed anything, but because they wanted to understand who I really was, a man they had never taken the time to know. The last time all three of us sat together on that porch, Rowan said, "Everything changed because of the divorce." "No," I corrected. "Everything changed because of the truth." Silence settled over us, not heavy, not sharp, but warm. It was the first silence we had ever shared without resentment. And as the sun dipped low across the fields, I understood the lesson this story was always meant to teach. Quiet people are not weak. Quiet people are observant. Quiet people survive storms because they prepare before anyone else notices the clouds. And when the day finally comes for them to speak, the truth lands with a force that cannot be ignored. Respect is not something you demand. It is something you live. And those who fail to see your worth do not diminish it. They only blind themselves to what was in front of them all along.